Kia ora koto katoa. Welcome to CARE's teaching on violence targeting transgender women and hate. This particular teaching is organized in response to the organizing of hate targeting transgender women that we are seeing currently in Aotearoa, and particularly with the arrival of Posey Parker this weekend. I have the pleasure of being joined today by CARE's researcher, Richa Sharma. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Richa. Richa has been earlier an intern with CARE and then working with us as a researcher on our work addressing particular forms of hate in the digital space as well as organizations that support hate. In doing that work, Richa herself has negotiated the organizing of hate that has been targeted at CARE and our research team. Richa brings a particular vantage point from her organizing work and activism in responding to this conversation today on the nature of hate and potential strategies for addressing it. So I'm going to go ahead and invite you to sort of walk me through sort of the overarching ideas of hate as you see it, Richa, as we go through some of the key concepts. So in the first part, I will walk through the presentation briefly outlining the key ideas, and then we will listen to Richa respond to these ideas, and then hopefully we will have a dialogue on the basis of that. So when we look at the experiences of violence among transgender women, what the body of research points toward are three contexts of that violence. One is the nature of stigma that is culturally constituted and the ways in which culture is used in order to produce and circulate stigma targeting transgender women and more broadly transgender communities. So the sense of stigma and the experience of stigma articulated by transgender women is often situated within the broader context of hegemonic cultural norms. These cultural norms shape the realms of acceptability. They shape the ideas of what the relationships ought to be like, and they shape the ideas of what is normal. This process of establishing that which is normal creates then the fundamental infrastructure of violence, because that which falls outside of the norm then or outside of the acceptable standards as dictated by the hegemonic cultural norms becomes the target of the violence. So, both the interplays of stigma and the workings of the hegemonic cultural norms work alongside a broader discursive climate of hate. So, this discursive climate of hate is established through the deployment of cultural norms, the very cultural norms that shape the ideas of what is socially acceptable, then set up a communicative infrastructure for calls to violence, for calls to exclusion, and for calls to erasure. So, within the context of the movement of the uh, white supremacy, within the context of neo-Nazi movements, within the context of various movements driven by hate, exclusion, or creating points of exclusion by establishing hegemonic cultural norms is a critical element in the broader infrastructure of violence. So, the point that I want to highlight, particularly in this slide, is that experiences of violence articulated by transgender women are directly intertwined with the discursive infrastructure, with the communicative spaces that reproduce and circulate the cultural norms. So, when we look at then extant scholarship on the nature of the discursive climate of hate, one of the arguments that is often put forth is that what you see in discourse does not really materialize. So, what you see online, for instance, that's how the argument goes. What you see online can be countered through alternative arguments or can be engaged in through arguments, creating counter arguments. And so when you let the argument goes that when you let diverse forms of arguments flourish, then you're countering the hate in that sense. This is not, however, borne out by research, and certainly not the research that we have carried out at CARE, looking at various forms of hate, including hate targeting transgender communities. What this line of research points to is that violent discourse that actually carries out violence through erasure, through otherizing, through techniques of dehumanizing, through the continual exclusion and erasure of a targeted community at the margins, is intertwined with the actual calls to violence. And often these calls to violence are played out through the use of images, they are played out through memes that repeat themselves, they are played out through the showcasing of particular videos that are demonstrating the violence, through actual and explicit calls to the violence as a strategy for safeguarding the purity of the culture. So, violent discourse and calls to violence, therefore, are intertwined. And they are, if you pay attention to the earlier slide that I presented, they are emergent from the work of otherizing through the portrayal of hegemonic cultural norm that establishes that which is outside of the culture, and that therefore this outside of the culture threatens the sanctity of the culture. Often, that this violent discourse is enacted through the narrative frame of intergenerational threats, or threats to children, threats to young people, threats to women. So, threats to those as part of the culture who need to be protected. So, the discursive climate, therefore, is held up by this notion of safeguarding the people within the culture. Of course, what is inherent here is the notion of protecting and safeguarding a sense of cultural purity, if you will. And you see this play out in various contexts of hate, including in white supremacist hate, where the violent discourse is generated as a, or and is projected as a strategy for safeguarding the purity of white cultures. So you can think of the narrative of white genocide with Muslims, with migrants, with rainbow communities threatening the purity of the white race. You can think of the great replacement theory articulated in this sense, as a framing device then to call for violence as a response to safeguarding culture and cultural purity. So these calls to violence then are intertwined with actual acts of violence. So when we see, for instance, the nature of violence that plays out in brick and mortar contexts, what we often see is that violence that is driven by hate is situated within a broader ecosystem of discourses of hate. It is situated within a broader ecosystem of discourses of violence. So when we actually track patterns of violence and hate in speech on digital platforms or on various media platforms or on political speeches, what we witness there is both the frequency and the volume of hate and calls to violence on particular communicative spaces directly relate to or connect to the actual acts of violence that are witnessed in these spaces. Now, one of the things that I want to point out here is that the dominant approach to examining this context of violence often individualizes the nature of the violence. It treats it as a product of an extremist act that is being carried out by an extremist. And what that kind of approach reflects is the broader whiteness of the literature and expert approaches, meaning that they reflect the taken for granted assumptions of the dominant white culture, which individualizes the hate and which individualizes acts of extremism. What actually needs to happen is that we need to look at overarching communicative contexts and discursive ecosystems, and specific individualized acts of violence need to be situated within those broader structures. And therefore, we need to ask critical questions about the driving forces that reproduce these structures and enable the discourses of violence to thrive. So, if you look at the nature of violent discourse, then this is quickly to recap some of the points I have already articulated. There are few key features of violent discourse. One of the salient features is the feature of othering. And this process of othering works through the production of other as a threat to the purity of the culture, to the safety of people within the culture, particularly those who are projected as being vulnerable within the culture. This work of othering takes place alongside narratives of dehumanization that reduce the targeted community to animal like portrayals or to portrayals that are less than human. We certainly see that in white supremacist discourses that target transgender women. We see that in white supremacist discourses that target Muslims. And this often, for instance, it takes place through the production of particular memes that do that work of dehumanization and normalize then acts of violence directed toward the dehumanized other. These processes of othering and dehumanization then work alongside explicit calls to exclusion. So the calls to exclusion clearly state that this community should not be included in the discursive space or should not have access to fundamental human rights because they are less than human. So the framing of a community as another and the dehumanizing process itself works then to produce the communicative processes of exclusion, which then work alongside erasure. So, active forms of communicative construction that seek to erase. So, within the context of hate that is directed at transgender women, you often find white supremacist discourses that call for specific acts of erasure. And these acts of erasure are justified as strategies for safeguarding the culture. So, for instance, to events such as transgender women reading stories to children in the community. The response of hate is one of erasure. So, organizing, white supremacists organize around this idea of protecting our children to legitimize then the acts of erasure. So when we then look at the violent discourse within the context of Aotearoa targeting transgender women, what we have seen over particularly the last month is the ways in which this violent discourse has magnified, manifold, particularly in two forms. One is through explicit calls for erasure, actual acts such as organizing of protests to erase, but then those connected to calls for various forms of violence as strategies for safeguarding the culture. So this is really concerning because what it points to is the ways in which the violence is actively and strategically being organized through discourse. So, if we look at hate that is targeted toward transgender women, there are four particular contexts of hate. Now, you would be familiar with a couple of these contexts, but I also want to highlight a couple of other sources of this hate. So, far right white supremacists, we see the ways in which neo Nazi discourses, various white supremacist discourses, particularly target transgender women. This form of targeting takes place within the context of the narrative of the Great Replacement theory. So, if you consider, for instance, the history of white supremacist terrorist attacks, you witness the power of narrative of the Great Replacement theory as an organizing force for material violence. We certainly saw this in Christchurch, and we are now seeing this within the context of attacks that are directly targeted at transgender communities and particularly transgender women. So there is a rise globally through interconnected um, far right white supremacist networks, this narrative of transgender women as threat to the culture. And we are seeing the increase in these narratives here in Aotearoa. Alongside white supremacist discourse, then we see discourses articulated by trans exclusionary radical feminists who will put forth the argument, and this is a key argument in the process of othering. That transgender women are not women. So, that work of othering then is used to particularly produce stigmas and call for various forms of exclusion. Now, here's the critical point, particularly when it comes to trans exclusionary radical feminists, is the placing of these arguments as a communicative inversion. So, if you're familiar with the work of the culture centered approach, communicative inversion is the turning of materiality on its head in order to portray the opposite. This is a strategy that is consistent, that is consistently used in fascist strategies of erasure in order to legitimize forms of violence. And we certainly see that in trans exclusionary radical feminist discourse, especially in terms of the ways in which it uses the language of radical feminism, the language of women's rights to fundamentally attack the human rights of transgender women, and to then legitimize these attacks by noting that transgender women are not really women. And that becomes then the connecting point that feeds into far right white supremacist discourse. So, one of the things that we have seen happen within the context of Posey Parker's visit to Australia is the very explicit interplay between Nazis and trans-exclusionary radical feminists. Now, this interplay in Australia is materialized with this particular visit, but it is integral to the discursive infrastructure, particularly in terms of the ways in which white supremacist, neo-Nazi communicative platforms, digital spaces draw upon the narratives of trans-exclusionary radical feminists. The other 2 points I want to make, these are key points, is that both of these exclusionary, hateful strategies that are connected to calls to violence are intertwined with mainstream politics. How so? To the extent that mainstream politics sees in these two movements sources of a voter base, they essentially become a market, if you will, and create a political opportunity for parties. So political parties speak to these movements driven by hate and violence, to the extent that they seek the audience base of these movements. So that is sort of the ways in which political parties mainstream this hate. There is another aspect too, though, which is that as political strategy, particularly within the context of elections, as we are in Aotearoa at this point, um, uh, the identification of this market segment, a segment of white supremacists and trans exclusionary radical feminists who have mainstreamed the othering of transgender women, the identification of that as a segment then directly contributes to political strategies that do not speak to the hate, that do not directly respond to the violence, but rather draw upon fairly facile discourses of free speech, creating the discursive infrastructure for free speech to mainstream this ideology of exclusion. What is critical to point out here is that the language of free speech and the instrument of free speech that is put into place to mainstream the hate fundamentally works through the erasure of the freedom of speech of marginalized communities, the erasure of voices of marginalized communities. So, this in itself is a critical communicative inversion that I would like you to attend to, which is that an ideology that is based upon othering, exclusion, and erasure draws upon the language of free speech and instruments of free speech in order to further mainstream these acts of erasure. The final point I want to make is that in our research at CARE, when we look at these discursive infrastructures of hate, it is very clear that the infrastructures are supported by capital, they are supported by economic resources, they are supported by funders that are funding the hate. It is therefore vital to look at the economic infrastructure that underlies this hate and that actually makes its circulation viable in democracies globally. So now let's look at some of the drivers of violence targeting transgender women. And this is a framework that is included in CARE's report on strategies, community-led strategies of violence prevention in diverse communities. And what we argue in that work is that the ideology of patriarchy and cisgender norms that works through violent erasure, through the upholding of the mainstream culture as a normal and therefore legitimizing acts of erasure and violence, work hand in hand with the infrastructures of colonialism. So, the colonial project as a strategy for theft of land, theft of culture, and imposition of a dominant white culture on colonized peoples becomes a framework for um, cultivating and circulating the hate. So, settler colonialism, neocolonialism continue to perpetuate hate directed toward communities at the margins, become because that hate is intertwined with the colonial structure. The other element within this infrastructure of hate is the element of whiteness, which takes the values of the dominant white culture as normative values and imposes it on diverse communities across the globe, on indigenous people and communities through the instrument of colonialism. So if you think about hate that is directed toward transgender women, toward rainbow communities broadly, that is intertwined with hate that is directed toward Muslims. It is intertwined with hate that is directed toward Tangata Fenua. So the intersections of these forms of violence are critical to unpack, which leads me to my next point, which is that the discursive infrastructure of violence targeted at transgender people and communities works alongside anti Semitism, specific forms of hate that targets Jewish communities. It is intertwined with Islamophobia. We see in various manifestos of extremists the ways in which hate toward transgender communities is placed alongside hate toward Muslims, both seen as threats to the purity of the white race. And within the context of Aotearoa, then this is connected to anti-Maori hate that is directed at Tangata Whenua, particularly played out in terms of particular narratives, which are themselves communicative inversions. Consider, for instance, the narrative of apartheid that is used by white supremacists to target Maori communities. Consider, for instance, strategies of the hate that are directed toward attacking Te Tiriti by framing Te Tiriti as anti-democratic. So what I want to point to here is that these various forms of violence and the underlying infrastructure of hate is they are interconnected with each other, and they are driven by then the interpenetrating ideologies of patriarchy, cisnormativity, whiteness, and colonialism. So, to conclude, what do we do in terms of building processes, strategies, structures for addressing the proliferation of hate that we are seeing, particularly hate targeting transgender women, that has become manifest with the visit of Posey Parker? Uh, our work and our review of the literature suggests that it is vital to address the structural sources of violence. It's important that we do not limit ourselves to individualistic responses or individualized responses. It is important that we look at structures, institutions, and the ways in which these structures and institutions are built to perpetuate whiteness, and through that process make white supremacy the norm in terms of the strategies of exclusion. So, addressing the structural sources of violence directed at transgender women is critical. So, our collective organizing, our policy frameworks need to explicitly look at the drivers of this violence. We must attend to the institutionalized context within which this hate is institutionalized. We saw it in the context of Australia, for instance, the institutionalization of hate through the police. So that fundamental infrastructure needs to be addressed. Similarly, we need to look at the institutionalized structure of migration, and we need to be asking critical questions such as what makes migration processes and migration criteria work in ways such that it is possible for um, uh, proponents of hate that come from allied or connected countries that reflect that same white colonial structure and make that movement easy while there are tremendous barriers for legitimate people from the global south, for gender diverse communities from the global south to move through these immigration spaces. So we need to look at the institutionalization of hate, bias, stigma, othering within immigration processes, and then really ask this question: what does immigration policy look like when it is anchored in the principles of theterity, and how then do we decolonize immigration by turning to theterity? We need to continually question and interrogate, particularly because this is an election year. This is our opportunity to interrogate the ways in which hate and violence is institutionalized within politics. We need to critically interrogate the frames that make this hate normal and legitimate. So, frames such as uh, uh, hate targeting transgender women ought to have the freedom to express itself. We need to be able to monitor those discourses, but also develop adequate strategies to respond to those discourses within politics. And then finally, there is a lot more work needed in terms of examining the funding structures and sources of hate, because the political economy of hate works through logics of capital. Hate circulates because it is profitable. So, who is funding this hate, and how to make the funding of hate illegal? How to regulate the funding of hate? So, I wrap up this teaching with a call for solidarity and in support with our uh, Rainbow Fana, particularly in solidarity with um, the many transgender women and communities of transgender women that we work with here at CARE. We see you, we stand with our bodies alongside you in this struggle, and we will continue to work collectively toward co creating an infrastructure that addresses this hate and puts an end to it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mohan. Yeah, I really appreciated this presentation for providing a framework in which to analyze hate and the kind of systemic nature of hate towards transgender women in Aotearoa. There were a few points that kind of stood out to me, particularly in the context of Posey Parker's arrival into Aotearoa and her events and the politics and the media surrounding it. One that really stood out to me was kind of this erasure of the contextual realities of hate in Aotearoa. Similarly to after the Christchurch mosque massacres in 2019, we saw a lot of the so-called like they are not us discourse around, oh, New Zealand isn't hateful. It's actually this person from Australia or this person from who's learned from their travels in these other countries, and we're seeing a lot of similar discourse around the Posey Parker tour, particularly around this idea that Posey Parker is importing this anti-trans hate into New Zealand when many trans women and many people who have worked in our communities will rather plainly state that this hate is present now and it has always been present as long as we can remember. So I think it's really important to really foreground the fact that this hate was present in New Zealand and was being acted on in New Zealand prior to Posey Parker ever crossing our borders. And that actually moves on to kind of this kind of fragility we see within our political class, even those who purport to be kind of progressive or on the left. where you will see politicians particularly speaking to these issues. And there was a particular politician who made the comment when criticized for their allowing of Posey Parker in through immigration, in that they weren't a magician, they weren't able to magic up a solution. When in reality, they're a cabinet minister. They, out of everyone in Aotearoa, have some of the most power to actually change the laws and the rules, and they have a certain level of ministerial oversight on these issues. And I found that fragility really, really fascinating and to see, and I think it pops up in a lot of other discourses around hate. On the context of anti-transgender hate in Aotearoa, we talked about hate from white supremacy, from the TERF community, from mainstream political parties, and from mainstream economic actors. But I think it's really important to delve into the reality of state violence on transgender people, particularly through the realm of healthcare. Yes, the example that comes up often when we talk about trans healthcare in Aotearoa and how inadequate it is looking at the gender affirming surgery service in Aotearoa, which at current is sitting at 410 referrals, is processing at about 10 surgeries per year. So for me, if I was to enter this list tomorrow, that would be an over 40-year waiting list for me to receive necessary surgery as a trans person. So me being 20, conventionally young, I would maybe have a chance of getting my healthcare publicly funded by the time I turn 60, which is really shocking, and I think is an example of that state violence that transgender people face every day, where we're told that healthcare for transgender people is a nice to have as opposed to a real necessity, which we all have a right to healthcare. And those flow-on effects from that lack of healthcare really impact our community, where we're almost forced into this medical tourism in countries like Thailand, and now in India it's starting to grow. And it economically locks out transgender communities from owning homes, having a comfortable retirement. These surgeries for an individual can cost upwards of 50,000, even reaching up into above $100,000. I've heard of some examples where women are paying $120,000 to receive what for them is very much life-saving surgery. And I've seen people have to empty out their retirement funds, just to get healthcare abroad, and empty out any funds they may have had and they may have been saving for owning a home. So the state has essentially locked transgender women, many transgender women, out of economic success or comfortable retirement. It's a real tough situation, and that kind of state violence, I think, needs to be really interrogated.
Wow, Richa, there is so much to process there. I want to start with the idea of state violence. In that framework, we talked about the ways in which the cis normativity is institutionalized into the structure through the processes of colonialism. Uh, could you speak a little bit to the nature of the settler colonial state specifically, and the ways in which that state violence, such as, say, the lack of access to even the basic healthcare, plays out?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating discussion. And it's something that we've seen repeated in many colonial and settler colonial states, where this idea that this kind of Eurocentric idea of transgender people as an other, or as a minor marginalized group, has been brought in many of these communities, you have historic evidence that transgender and gender diverse people have existed, whether it be the Fa'afafine of the Pacific, or Hijra in India, or Takatapui here in Aotearoa. These people, gender diverse people, have very much been active and you know uh, accepted members of our communities. But it's really, we've seen the kind of attitude and the hate towards transgender people and the othering of transgender people really grow out of that colonialism, where for the most part the British and other European states have brought in these kind of Christian driven values of transgender people being sinful or not accepted. And that not only has materialized in public discourse, but also through laws. And it's actually really funny. It's really funny to see that in a lot of countries they've retained the penal code from British colonization, and that same penal code, which ends up being a lot more exclusive than even the laws in the UK, and it's kind of stuck around in this in the reality of a lot of these colonial states.
So, Richa, there is this the really important point to your conversation, which you started with, this argument that hate has always been a part of the landscape of Aotearoa, and that's an argument that is repeated in the literature as well, in terms of both hate experienced by transgender communities, as well as hate in different forms experienced by Tangata Whenua historically. At the same time, what we are seeing is a rise in global networks of hate, if you will. And those global networks of hate are finding ways of sort of picking up on existing forms of hate in Aotearoa. So how do you grapple between these two elements, that there is a history of hate here, but at the same time, what we are seeing is a global influence of hate that is clearly activating and sort of taking this hate to quite substantially large proportions?
Mm. Yeah, fascinating question, Mohan. I think particularly when we look at the proliferation of these kind of global movements of hate, I think a lot of the blame, as it were, can be placed squarely in the hands of social media and the companies controlling social media, such as Facebook, Google, etc. There's been some literature, and we've seen that the way these algorithms work in the context of social media can bring people down this kind of this kind of rabbit hole. This rabbit hole of hate, and really radicalize people just through what they're seeing every day when they're scrolling on their phones. And I think that has really been key, where we've started to see international voices speaking against trans people, and that hate moving here. That's the reason why when Posey Parker was brought up as coming to New Zealand, it immediately sent off flags for trans people, as well as really signaled to TERFs here that, oh, one of ours is coming over. Somebody they might have seen while scrolling on the internet. And another way in which that kind of global movement moves itself into Aotearoa is through the movement of finances of funding. We recently, on Thursday, Posey Parker actually confirmed that she was at least in part being funded by CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Coalition, I believe, which is a PAC in the States, as well as having presence in Australia. And it's a organization that's been very strong in its support of previous President Donald Trump, very much a figurehead of hate. It's been very strong in its support of anti-abortion laws being passed in the States right now, as well as laws being passed in some American states that are excluding trans people from public life. We've seen some states in the South even go as far as proposing that we prosecute parents for allowing the children to transition, And I worry that with these networks on social media that we might start seeing discourse like that genuinely being reproduced and proposed in Aotearoa come this election or maybe perhaps the next election.
Hmm. So, thanks, Richa, for sort of pointing this out so clearly. So, here's my follow up question. And you don't have to answer it if sort of we don't have a good sense of what this looks like right now. But what I'm wondering is the CPAC, for instance, works through politicians, that part that I talked about, mainstreaming of hate into politics. It works through politicians to mainstream the hate. So in Aotearoa, do we know which politicians, which political parties have the linkages with CPAC or similar kinds of organizations?
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't, is there a room for carrying out that kind of study to actually examine this critically in terms of
Yeah,
where this group
absolutely.
is coming from?
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, the way that political party finances are organized in Aotearoa, and I have experience of this behind the scenes, is quite horrendously untransparent, I should say. Donations of over, I believe it's $1,500 have to be reported on the public ledger, but we've seen in the past that there are ways around that, such as, rather than having one organization such as CPAC directly fund an election campaign, having that spread out through micro donations of, a conservative page or a turf page on the internet being like, hey, everyone donate to this party, etc., or that word of mouth spread. In terms of linkages between political parties and transphobic groups, we've certainly seen that materialize in Aotearoa. The classic example would be the National Party's hiring of noted transphobic actor Annie O'Brien as their chief of press, I believe, during the Judith Collins era of the National Party. Annie O'Brien, of course, being instrumental in the growth of New Zealand transphobic group Speak Up for Women. So those linkages absolutely exist, and I do wonder what the capacity is for us to interrogate where political parties are getting them their funding and where they're getting their support.
So you're talking about the National Party in this instance. That's a fairly that's a mainstream party. So that um, is really concerning in terms of um, what one might argue is how already perhaps transphobia has been mainstreamed uh, into politics.
Mm.
Um, I'm just processing that still, Richa, particularly in terms of you're saying, looking at the political landscape in terms of policy making, and whether in this election cycle or by the next one, the kind of anti-transgender policies, for instance, that we are seeing in the US, could potentially take hold here, right? So, what
Mm.
are some potential strategies for prevention? What are some strategies for addressing this before it takes hold? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I do think that for marginalized communities globally and historically, um, the real the ways whether we influence policy always comes down to the grassroots. Often our marginalized communities are nowhere near as well resourced as our opponents or those who are seeking to further marginalize us. And it's through actions such as these counter protests this weekend, involvement within our political system, whether that be through a party or through an interest group, you know, and even it may seem a little bit naive, but sending a letter to your MP, example stating that, oh, I think the decision made by Immigration NZ on Posey Parker's entry to this country was abhorrent, and explaining your thought. There's these kind of democratic paths to influencing policy in New Zealand, and at the end of the day, if a political party no longer sees transphobic people as a valuable vote bank, or one that's perhaps too poisonous to consider courting, that's when we'll start to see real change. I mean, last election we saw the New Conservative Party, which is a party off the fringe, albeit, but proposing, banning critical race theory and banning gender ideology from being taught in schools, which, you can question whether it even is taught in schools as things stand. But we saw the electorate really signal that wasn't something that they were okay with, and there was plenty of discourse around that. So yeah, it's going to be difficult, but at the end, it's going to come down to how we organize on the grassroots.
Yeah, at the same time, it seems to be, you talked about political fragility. At the same time, the other part, it seems to be that there seems to be political calculation. For instance, you think about the hate speech law, and there seems to be political calculation around what is necessary for survival at this point, and particularly so with far right hate and the kind of narrative of free speech around that being magnified, so that in political calculations, it might seem like this is something one can give up on because it's not politically viable, if you will. So, how does one respond to that kind of political opportunism?
Oh, that'll be just a question for the Labour and National Party political war rooms, I would say. It's really because it does end up for these parties. It seems almost as a bit of a toss up between human rights and winning the next election, which frankly isn't really how politics should be done in a democratic society. But of course, me saying that's not going to change very much. So it will be a big challenge in terms of how we influence these groups, these political parties, to move away from these calculations. And yeah, again, it will come down to the grassroots to lobby these political parties to make decisions in favor of our community. And we've already seen with Labour's recent actions on Posey Parker, we've seen a substantial out backlash, both from people who are traditionally Labour voters. Even I've seen in comments online, this is anecdotal, of even Labour voters saying to Labour MPs and to the Labour Party, "Don't show up at Pride next year. You have shown your true face." So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how if that opportunism still exists, or whether big actions like this have started to shift the public discourse on transphobia and on these kind of turf organizations. We're yet to see where that's lying.
So, Richa, moving toward wrapping up, looking to this weekend, Posey Parker is going to be here. I know that you have also said that this hate has been part of the infrastructure here. So it's not in that sense as if this is entirely foreign and new, right? Having said that, there also seems to be a momentum in terms of the mobilization of the far right and white supremacists. And what is particularly concerning in the backdrop of the Christchurch terror attack is sort of the ways in which the discourses of hate have magnified, it seems, and also found ways of connecting different anchors of hate, like different hate groups, white supremacists and neo-Nazis of different forms, into spaces, right? So what is your message, or what is your hope, thinking through this coming weekend?
Yeah, fantastic. I think it lies not just with the transgender community, but particularly even with cisgender people, to really make themselves seen this weekend at the counter protests. For too long, trans issues have been relegated as something that only trans people will speak about. And what is that? A couple percentage of the population? That's not enough to be electorally valuable. And I think this weekend we really need to show that actually, no, it's not just trans people who are talking about these issues, but this is our whānau, these are our friends, these are our co-workers, and really to bring that energy together. Many trans people won't feel safe coming out this weekend to the counter protests, which is absolutely understandable considering the context of some of the police violence, etc., I've seen coming through from Australia. But I think it's really valuable that if there's a counter protest happening near you, to turn up and to amplify trans voices on social media, and to really bring this discussion up, whether it's at the dinner table or around the water cooler at work.
Thank you so much, Richa. To our audience here in Aotearoa, this is a call. It's a call that aligns well with the work that we do at CARE, that suggests that it is only through our participation and everyday forms of engagement in our democracies and through our resistance to organizing forms of hate do we dismantle hate. Richa, thank you for that invitation for the broader networks of solidarity to show up and to actually build these infrastructures to protest against the hate. And also thank you, Richa, for offering us the hope that that there is a possibility of transformation, and perhaps that lies in voices and in listening to the voices of the communities, in this case transgender women who are targeted with the hate. That again is a powerful message that is at the heart of the way we see the work of listening at CARE, that perhaps building these infrastructures of listening is critical, and how do we sustain them and how do we amplify them is going to be our ongoing work. So thank you once again, Richa. Before we part, I want to just share the space with you to say any parting words if you have.
No, it's been fantastic speaking to you today, Mohan, and thank you for having me. I think I've said what I need to say. I'll just reiterate one more time to get out there this weekend and make your voices heard and show your support for the transgender community. Because again, this isn't just about us. This is our whānau. This is our co-workers. This is our community more overall.